But welcome to the 2021 Land Lab Lecture Series. And as I think many of you all know, I am leading an inaugural studio this spring that frames a UVA satellite site, Milton Airfield, as a mesocosm for ways of knowing through situated making. And so where students will research design, or will research, design, and build a mesocosm investigation to then challenge, interrogate, and potentially reorient through a series of exercises that explore alternative ways of knowing and thus sort of creating knowledge. And then in tandem to this studio is this lecture series, which is a parallel effort in positioning the studio's efforts on site within a history of precedents and theory, within a precedents and theory and practice. And so today we have Dr. Roland Gustavsson. I'm very happy to have him here. He completed his 1976 or completed his master's in 1976 in landscape architecture, and immediately took up research and teaching position. And after obtaining his doctorate in 1987, as the only or the second landscape architect in Sweden with a doctorate at that time. And his ambition was to really pioneer a bridge between academia and practice through a position at the university. And so in 1994, he was appointed professor in planning design and landscape management at the Department of Landscape Planning in the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. And it's there where he founded the school's landscape laboratory, really a paragon of embodied research. And I mean, you probably heard me refer to him as sort of the grandfather of landscape laboratories. It's for a good reason. I mean, he argues that the dominance of abstract conceptual thinking and indoor sort of architectural situations must be met by an increase in the creative development of outdoor learning approaches, which really stress sort of the lived experience and the concrete and the touch of the world. And so he suggests one of the most important challenges for landscape architectural education today is to improve the balance between sort of this dominance of conceptual thinking in interior architectural situations and outdoor training, which really acknowledges the time dependence in all living processes and consequently of most landscape architecture. So with that, will you please join me in welcoming Roland Gustavsson?
Oh. Thank you. Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. And it's wonderful, of course, to meet you all and to be here in Scandinavia, sitting here. And I will just go and find my screen here.
Yeah, I will help you share. So,
right.
So
my wife, Eva, she's also a landscape architect, and we keep together. Okay, is that okay? And yes, it's about the landscape laboratory at ALNARP, and it's also about, we call it the Scandinavian concept of landscape laboratory. And of course, it can change a lot of what you mean with a landscape laboratory, but I will try to take it from the beginning and how we have succeeded to create 3 big labs, 2 in Sweden and 1 in Denmark. And the first one is a campus lab at our university. And it's the major educational place for the landscape architect and landscape design and planning here. And it's of course convenient to have a lab very close, so you can go out every day if you wish. You can take the lab as a kind of morning gym if you like, and you can see its variations, and that's part of it. And you can also see that the university owns the whole land, agricultural land, and you have a kind of forest island in the middle that we have expanded by the lab. And it's very much urbanized, and we have Copenhagen just across. And agriculture have so far not really reacted on the possibility to show the agricultural landscape as a kind of belonging to an urban society for tomorrow. So it has more been that they wanted us to keep to the park landscape and keep to the trees. And so we did in the first step. But if we think about the lab and why we have a lab, I think that it's very important that you, often we had a group that be working together with park departments and consultancies all over southern and middle of Sweden and in Denmark and a little in England and Netherlands. We were quite tired of traveling all the time and the small possibilities to come, return and to follow it day by day. So we needed also a landscape lab at home, and that we got. And the good thing was that we almost at the same time, a little about 10 years later, we got the first landscape lab at Jutland in Denmark, Western Denmark. And it was an expansion of a city called Holstebro. And the park department read a book I had been writing, and then they wanted me to move to Denmark and to start a first landscape lab also in Denmark. And I think that this Letten, it's interesting, by the way, the concept is created because it's a meeting between the urban and the rural cultures. And in most cases, it's just expanding a city culture, and the rural culture have to really disappear. But in this case, there are a place for a new culture which can link to both. And close to the housing groups, as you can see here, you have a forestry taking care of the wind and the coldness, and also much more easy in a multifunctional concept. And then south of it, you have the agricultural land where they kept the farmer, and they kept a kind of emptiness for people moving in so they could cultivate their own plants and vegetables. And it has worked pretty well. And here you see these close zones to the housing areas where you have the wooded plantations, and also permission to have the back garden, private back garden on this public land, wooded land. And then right at the bottom, you see waiting for the bus, you can see all the cattle. And these cattle are bought early in the years by older people that have organized themselves. So they are newcomers, and they also distribute meat and so on, and it's working pretty well. And also exactly parallel to ALNARP, we had a third landscape lab, which we got together with forestry in Sweden. You know that forestry is very important for our export and finance. So it's extremely important that you can work with them. And the forest industry became very interested in it, the concept, and were very positive about it. And they were very much supporting us. And all foresters today educated in Sweden, they go to this lab, so everyone experiences it. And for me as a landscape architect, I think it's important because it raised the question about landscape architecture, if it could include production. And of course, aesthetics and landscape architecture can include production. So we created what we call a kind of complexity ladder, which you can see to the left, where you have more environmental led and you have more production led, and then you can have a kind of in between where it's both good economy and both good environmental. And in that way we have tried actually 70 different mixtures, and that we don't have so much trees that can become a forest in Sweden, but here you can find, I think, all the mixtures that are possible for not exotics, but the Swedish indigenous plants here in Snogaholm. And also spruce and pines were included, because spruce and pine are major trees for the forest industry. And you can see from these pictures here that we go with our students and we go with excursions. We go for different kind of dialogues in all the laboratories. And you can see that the plantations in these cases are a mixture of long-term trees together with those trees that goes very quick from the beginning, that nurse the long-term trees, like the Canadian hybrid aspen to the left down, and you have larch and birch, and you can also see that we create a kind of small paths and so on, so we're thinking about how you move around. And even if it's winter time and part of our students come from China and so on and have no boots, they appreciate very much to go out in the concrete like this to discuss. And they are often very creative, so you can't imagine in advance how the student will behave, you know. And I think that is very good to have like that. So we are discussing, in this case, we're discussing that you could plant a lot and rather simple, and then you leave something which is called open land, grazed, and that give a main structure. And you can talk about the step one, and then you can say that, well, within 10 years, we will include parts of what is today just forest as a kind of half-open English landscape style, where you have cattle grazing it and so on, which is maybe the most attractive. And then you get open and you get half-open and you get fully covered with trees. We had been working for about 10 years when we found out that we were not the first, and I mean that had been ridiculous to think. But actually there are two brothers in Germany that, well, when I was in Ohio, for example, in Humboldt Park, I saw that Humboldt is world known. And Wilhelm von Humboldt is said to be the father of modern pedagogic training, which is coming both ways. And he has actually founded two terms that we are using very much, one which is laboratory and one which is seminar, and both terms are his terms. And he was worried in his time that university was split into different disciplines, and that these disciplines had not enough of contact with each other. So he wanted human science to be linked to natural science, and he wanted to have a kind of arena to let them meet and discuss, and that would be the best future. And Alexander von Humboldt, he is said to be the father of natural geography, and he was a great traveler. And in that way, we can say that we follow him, that we think that we need good references. And sometimes when you need good references, you can't stay in your own culture or in your own country. You have to go pretty far, and I come back to that. And I also will mention Jens Jensen, of course. I think you all know about him. He's quite unknown in Scandinavia, even if I would say that he is the most successful landscape architect born in Scandinavia. And he's interesting because he had both inside himself with human science and natural science, and he had both countryside culture and city culture, and he wanted to be a bridger. And he was advocating very much that you shouldn't copy the European, and you shouldn't even copy the East Coast, but you should keep to the meta region that you belong to. So he's very much landscape led. As a research team, we had been traveling, researching for a 10-year project, experimenting of how we could use much more ecology in landscape planning and architecture, in housing areas and park areas, and landscape for children, and also traffic landscapes. And we also, of course, we're not only thinking, when you think about nature and so on, that when you have trees and shrubs, there are always also perennials, and perennials make you have all these colorful carpets in springtime and so on. And we tried to use the wildflower, and this is an example from one of the cities. And I came back 20 years later and took this photo. And this shows how we seeded and planted square meters, and they are alive, but they didn't spread to these carpets. So it was a complete failure. And you can't, from that, you can't say that you just plant them and they will do the job themselves because they are indigenous plants. That's not the fact. So we try new approaches, and the landscape labs made us have the chance to continue. And we were a mixed group, and have always been a mixed group, with several ecologists and several landscape architects and horticulturists and foresters and historical people and so on. So we have tried to give to each other and to overlap. And this is Morten Hammer, who plant and seed what we saw 20 years later. And also you see from taken from Cambridge in England, where they had a nursery with wild plants for meadows. And we started after advices from Cambridge. There have been quite much written in Swedish, because we are still within a period before everyone had to write in English. And I mean, it's pretty difficult when you come from another language to do that. So you have to excuse me. But I remember I was working together with one of the most famous in England, Robert Trigay. He was the one who was responsible for the outdoor green and the Olympic Games of London, for example. And when we wrote our first shared report, he got the first suggestion from me, and then I got it back, and he said that everything is perfect, Roland. I just wanted it to sound a little more English, and then everything was red. So he changed everything. That was the beginning. But you have to train work with it, of course. The other here, the one I wrote this book together is called Thorleif Ingelög. And he's actually the real pioneer in Sweden with taking care of flora and fauna in agriculture and forestry. So he set up a group, and they had affected the Swedish agriculture and forestry extremely much. So indigenous species he knows a lot about. And we found each other through seminars where we shared the leadership, and then it became a book 8 years later.
The New Landscape is the title.
Yeah, The New Landscape is the title, and there is an English translation also that you can get hold of. And it's very much that you shouldn't separate environmental values from production values so much as you do today. So it was a try to spread that kind of message. Otherwise, I think it was 2009 with this article in JOLA, Landscape Architect Journal, where I wrote an article about the touch of dynamic vegetation and embodied knowledge and comparing with architecture and the importance of know your material. And that we can't think of form and architecture as something static, but we have to understand much more of dynamics, and that they are formed about the social positions, about neighbors, and about also generation to generations. And when you start to think that way, you actually make almost a revolution within landscape architecture, because that's not the matter. And here is more recent, 2016, the international magazine Scape, where there is a theme number about landscape laboratories in Europe. And there is one city in Germany, those responses, they came to our campus, and then they took our reports and translated them into German. And then they have tried to make something very similar to what we have done. Yeah, this to the right, you see that there is a new book coming out. Anders Busse Nielsen, who is a professor in Copenhagen today, and Lisa Diedrich, professor in ALNARP and also in Munich, and Catherine Catu in Paris and Budapest in Hungary. They are editors for a very ambitious book that take up the landscape lab as a subject.
Will be released?
They say actually it will be released to this summer, but let's hope for early autumn.
And the title?
Woods Go Urban is the suggestion. That means that we bridge and not try to destroy the rural culture. When you see a landscape lab, I think it is really to get a chance to follow something through different periods, stages, ages, and you have to, you can compare it with giving birth to a child of your own that you have to learn to appreciate, and most of all maybe to get to understand. And in this way, you have a first stage, which is an establishment stage, but then after that comes a very interesting teenager phase, where you often talk about children as if they become something very special in society and in life, they may be a little too much as teenagers, and you should really take care of them. And in this case, it's very similar, but in practice, they are left over to technical people who just thinking about the final phase 50 or 100 years later. And that is not fair. This is an example where you see the dynamics from right at the beginning. We have dug, opened the water culvert, and create a small waters and a water course. And then about 10 years later, you have to the right the same place. And then you can try to remember this and take this today. And you see the complexity and the richness of a place is obvious that it becomes something very, very different. And we have to live. It's a difficult job for us to understand dynamics and to keep it in your mind that it's not only this, but it's also that and that. and try to find the advantages in all stages. I think it's also about outdoor learning and learning while being out in the concrete, trying to be visionary, not only of what you see, but what you see make you reflect about what could be exciting for competitions in very different situations. So we have in Sweden, for example, many good examples of groups, teams that have won very big competitions, also for inner city environment and so on, while walking out in the lab trying to find the ideas and so on. So I think this concrete, the different places, the different characters make you more intelligent and more, it's more easy for you to find good ideas and not only to copy. Otherwise, we could have used of natural science after 3, 4, 5 years trying to just measure to see what trees have grown better and how they grow the first years. And these are examples of 2 of the key species, Fagus sylvatica beech, very close to the American beech, and hazel, which I think you also have. And these 2 shows surprisingly that if you plant them as a monoculture, or if you plant them in mixed stands with other species, you see that they grow much, much better while you plant them with other species and not in monocultures. And I mean, that is interesting to see genetically over millions of years this has happened. Otherwise, we are talking very much about that when you bring, for example, students to the landscape lab, or always the same day or the day before or after, we go to a more mature landscape, and we want to have reflections in between what is new, young, and what have been there for maybe hundreds of years. And this bridging and reflection we think is very important. The same with the countryside landscape and the city landscape. This is what was so typical Swedish up till about 100 years ago, and that was these half-open grace landscapes where you can find everywhere. And I think still today in the world, in this climate zone, we have most of those kind of types. My father, he was a forester, and when he was young, starting as a forester, 80% of his time were in this grace landscape, how to take care of both the grass and the trees at the same time. And if you compare this with urban landscapes, this is a mountain area, and again, cattle and pastoral systems, north of Sweden. And this is another tradition, which is about haymaking, where you have trees and shrubs in a mosaic together with grasses, corridors and glades and big openings in a mosaic system that you also found actually in Denmark and Britain and so on. And it's so extremely attractive, and it's extremely species rich. So it's valuable to understand, but it's difficult to find, of course. Nowadays, yeah. So these are, we have an island half the way to Russia, which is called Gotland, and there you find hundreds of them. So it's a real living system. So on one side, we had this reference landscape approach where you had good references, and with reference it was traveling, but it was also to find at home areas that were of particular interest, and then not only visit them once, but making the recordings and revisiting over periods of at least 10, 15 years. So be patient, we said to each other. And this is an example of a special method where you just like a slice of cheese go through a woodland stand. And it's a description type which were made, founded by botanists from Cambridge in England for tropical forest. And it shows what is interesting for a landscape architect, the shapes and the spatial qualities, horizontal and vertical. And you can, if you go through these, making very, very exact, you can then go back and you can then record. And they're called profile diagrams. Profile diagrams. This is an example of a nightingale shrub, which I followed from 1982 to 2006. And you can, by individual to individual and even more closer, main branches to main branches, follow this section in the profile diagrams and see how they act when they come very close to each other.
It's a natural stand.
And it's a natural stand out in the countryside. And by doing this, of course, you learn extremely much and you understand the dynamics of architecture. So in this way, we can translate this situation to urban situations, and we can see how you can categorize into different layers and also use a kind of key for understanding why it is like it is, with how some trees can stand very much shadow, others are extremely light depending, and so on. And by doing these interpretations, you can understand the systems. And we try to find out not only for indigenous plants, but of course it's the same with plants coming from other parts of the world. And this is from my doctorate thesis, where I actually followed my father, who was the head of a forestry school, and he was the exception among foresters staying at the same place for over 50 years. And in that case, I could make my doctoral thesis of following him and his notes from the 1930s and then up to 1970s when I made my recordings. But I was using what I call the structure of vegetation, trying to understand the architecture much more carefully. So this is a kind of section I follow through time. And again, it's extremely carefully done. And below you have the last one in a larger scale. And here are, again, this combination of pioneers together with secondary trees, which create very, very interesting, actually, patterns, and also create a kind of philosophy for how you should plant, in what spacings and so on you should, intervals between plants you should have. And this is a park plantation where we call it the standard trees for lollipops. I don't know if you use the same word for them, but I think we have had enough for them. So we want something better to eat, taste. But these lollipops, we thought that they could have a kind of effect for long term. And they cost, of course, a lot of money, while the small tree plants in the long term shows to be much more competitive. And the individual trees, the lollipops, they never understand that they are part of a group. They behave like they are individuals for long term. Yeah, so in this case, it's, let's see here, I can show you here, we have one here, and down below here, you see that it's overgrown. It will probably not survive. And here you have another one. And you see that it behaves extremely like an individual. So it's too strong in competition of those under. And here it's better, but they have difficulties, and it shows how plant quality is an important issue. We were traveling a lot, and we started actually going to Britain, and they were very generous. And at the time, there was a professor in Manchester called Ian Laurie. And Ian Laurie was the man who made the British to change their names from garden architect to landscape architects. And he also made the first conference called Nature in Cities. And he published a book called also Nature in Cities. And that shows that he thought that nature and city belong to each other, rather than that you should keep nature outside of a city. And this is a movement that went into Britain, which was calling ecological park, that every city that was proud should have their ecological park, and not in a marginal place, but like a place like this, the Tower Bridge, just across the Parliament in London. And so this was the first ecological park in Britain, I think. And this is another one which is still there, together with children daycare, very close to Piccadilly Circus, very, very central in London. And those parks meant an interest for wildlife in cities, together with the most urban you can think about. And other places you can see at the bottom here, like Oakwood in between Manchester and Liverpool, that Ian Laurie helped us to get in contact with the design team and Robert Tregay in Oakwood. And we had for many, many years a cooperation and wrote reports together. So most of the reports and articles were not published in Swedish, and in Sweden it was more published in Britain. And we were maybe more well-known in Britain than in Sweden. Another place with a map, the plan is Gillis in the Netherlands, where they made a special children landscape in between the houses, 4 or 5 flat high houses. And those two at the top shows that we got a very good contact with China, and we were allowed to enter the inner part of China to find all these garden plants in the wild. And those kind of plant hunting and make a kind of sound understanding that you can really, really use. And we have been several in the group through the years that have been traveling a lot like that. And this is, of course, another fantastic picture from Portugal. And I brought it here just to show that pollarding and pruning and so on, like urban ways to treat trees, have come, of course, from older cultures in countryside. And if you think that we are standardizing too much and make it too oversimplistic in urban environment, it's time to go back to where they came from and look as living systems, how they are doing. And then you can find a lot. So this belongs to the reference landscape. You can also say that, I mean, we can't find a biological system in cities which is really old as a biological system. They are all extremely young because they were planted, most of them after the Second World War. And so we need to have an understanding of how they behave as old, also to find them in other places. Romania is a country, especially the mountain landscapes, which are extremely interesting for I think also from the United States. So these are from Romania. So it's a haymaking, and you can see very often an involvement of trees and shrubs within the open. And look at the people, are they without shoes or cutting their hay?
Ja, men också folk idag behöver komma ut.
Yeah, you could say also that the park department, what they do today, they sit in the machineries. So in a way, it is to start to use your body again, and a kind of handcraft and art and craft movement in a new fashion that would come probably. In France, for example, you're not allowed to drive your garden machineries through weekends and so on. So they have started to look at it. Another fantastic picture from Romania. And again, Romania, where you have all this, and you can suddenly understand when it comes to historical document how it has been looking like when it was 100% living systems. Copies and so on, which we are talking a lot about in the landscape labs. You can see how they are working in the farming culture. Now, also, I just wanted to show you this period, the 2 periods I had in Ohio. And we were concentrating, we had a whole team of teachers and students concentrating and working with transformation between rural to urban situations and outdoor teaching with then studio teaching. And these are, I think, fantastic examples, for example, of how do you plant linked to a water line. You can see along a river how fantastic dramatic it becomes and meaningful it becomes when the trees has a special position. But if you just plant them about 1.5 meters from the water in a park landscape, it becomes just boring. Or here in a ravine, and then at the studio showing how extreme positions for trees and so on makes it special. So we have to get rid of all these anonymous positions for trees in urban landscapes, that's for sure. So this is meant to be a opener. So you open a new door for possibilities, and I think it affected and was appreciated extremely much. And this you can see that it's very carefully done above the ground, but under the ground it's a test of imagination. And you can see that we lack knowledge and we should have much more knowledge. It's a water stream landscape, so I mean this is not possible for trees to grow like this. They should have much more concentrated roots because of the water table. They're higher up, of course. So this is from the studio. And this also shows that it's not only soil richness that makes something attractive, but you can actually work with the contrast rather, and work with beauty and specific personalities and so on for trees and so on. Those that are working in very tough environmental situations is something. So Eva says that you should then have small plants so they can take that chance and not go faster than they can live with. So if you, as a plant that grows slow, you can create a big personality. If they go fast, they can become anonymous. Good soldiers, maybe. Yeah, also that who has said that a beautiful tree should be straight, going right up and having a well-balanced crown? No one has never said that, and you can actually support that it's leaning and so on, and create something specific. So in these ways, we are bridging and we are reflecting about nature and urban and man-made environments. And coming to a situation where you have actually difficult to plant, and then finding that there are situations where you have what is called dense planting or cluster planting or patch planting or planting mosaics, where you can plant small plants of just 30, 50 centimeter, about 30 centimeter from each other, and they can live with it. And not only for 5 years, but they can actually live with it for absolutely more than 100 years. So that creates a possibility for coming out to completely different architectural expressions. It's beech and hornbeam and lime tree in these cases. And after the lab, we have tried to create a new generation of landscape labs. So this is an example where we are using spare planting with dense planting and so on, and also getting through with species that have had difficulties if we planted normal, but then when planting them very dense, no problem. And it's not only about trees, but this is a pond we made in one city, and it shows how you plant perennials and link to terrain, the terrain, and you understand the place, and then you adapt to the place. I have said that dynamic was one of the main reasons why we think it was very valuable to work with it, and with the landscape lab. And we started rather early to try to find out older people that had been masters of their time, and found them up, and they had all been forgotten. And then when we took them to the labs and we interviewed them and asked them, what will become of this and what are the problems, and what are the possibilities? And they were absolutely extremely visionary. And it was fantastic to meet them. And then after these old guys, we took instead different professions that we should think about being involved, not only landscape architects, but also artists and horticulturists and foresters. And then they could find their own places in the labs, and we made them work for 3 summers and working with their own places, and I come back to that. But it became, of course, another thing, and we call the project Young Designers and Managers Express Themselves in a Young Landscape. And we switched the design process. So instead of sketching the beginning, we started finding and understanding the place, and then working with your body. And then afterwards to make the sketches and the plans to be communicative and document it. And we went down to 7, 12 years old children and invited them, trying to design and trying to pretend they are the true managers of future. And they took it very serious, and we were really much backed up by the teachers and so on. So they had, they should have 1 week, but they had 3 weeks. And then they came back, presented for the professors and the researchers and the young, and it became very interesting. And this is one example where, I mean, they didn't behave as we were thinking. They didn't mind to go outside of the paths we had made. They like the mud and water, of course, all the micro rooms. And also they had a kind of humoristic way of a plantation. And here it was very important that you made the people visiting the park to go into the mouth of a dragon. So some basic concepts of a lab. We were in the modernistic period, and we had lost the interior rooms where you have a canopy above, or the open room belong to the forest rooms that you see on the left. And at the bottom you see the modernistic room where you have the blue sky. And to the right, you have what has been important in two labs, the behavior of the wind. So you can work with the wind and understand. And there were a lot of research in Germany and Denmark that we could catch. And we also identified different types. And then we, with red dots, see what types have we tested in the landscape labs. And we see that it's very much the high woodland types. And because we were working with foresters, they didn't like the shrubs, and they didn't like the coppice types. So we had to wait till another lab, and that became Sletten lab. Also, we came through a phenomena called the shit fence, that we had fenced it off, the plantations, for rabbits and rodeos and so on. And suddenly we saw that the birds were flying after eating the fruits and the berries, and then sitting at these fences and shitting. And then we got a very species-rich hedge in all cases. And so you can use it as an approach. We tested if we have small space of green, like a kind of green belt corridors, which is only 10 meter wide, and we want a walk also in the middle. How can you really succeed to make something out of it? And here are examples that shows that it can be so extremely different in basic characters. Is unbelievable. But we are not using it. We are very seldom using this 10 to 12 meter, but we still use them just 5-6 meter, and then it becomes just a wall with no interior. We had a park called Tuniselius Park, where you had this repetition, where we tried to set up the same systems with different plants coming from different parts of the world. So we had one European, and then one North American, from Northern Appalachian, and then one from East Asian. And then we tested who are the best, or which are the best, I mean. And actually we could say that the exotics make it very well, but they're not too aggressive in Sweden, not in these cases. And we found also that we needed to have more nutrient-rich at the establishment phase for the perennials. So we were using, it looks like land art, but it's newspapers, and then it's compost soil. And 1 year after, you have it like this with American perennials. So it's possible to make, but you never see it in practice, and it's small money. Yeah, so in this way, just like designing a car, we wanted to work with prototypes to make the concepts alive, and then test drive them, and then trying to identify others through this driving. We started to work with biotopes and habitats, and we continued actually to work much more with how people are moving in an area, and what are the places, and build up approaches towards those instead. And this is a new generation landscape lab, which shows that there is no reason just to have one route, so because then you have to go back to the same route and it's boring. So you should have parallel routes, and each route can have their basic character, and they can be very close to each other actually, and you can build up vegetation from the roots, but start with the roots. And when it comes to children, you can also predict how they behave and how they set up a kind of a pattern of paths and places. And this is an imagine of what should happen within 5 years. But it actually, in this case, happened after 2 years. And sometimes this has been one of the most attractive. People have loved these politicians and so on. And here, I mean, it's also fair to say that you can't deal with this if you just see it as a stand. You have also to see it as a walk, and the walk has to be respected as a walk. So this informal avenue can persist through 50 or 100 years. And very often it's about surprising. Surprises that you come with something where you don't expect it. It's also about avenues. I mean, we have so many diseases which are epidemic in Sweden and Denmark and Europe today. So for long-lasting key elements of the landscape as avenues, we can't have formal with only one trees, avenues that it should be a kind of lie for professionalism if you suggest like that. So we stand in front of a completely new approach of avenues for future that have both formality and informality. Others are lines like borders, woodland borders, and making special spaces which becomes places, like this with the hybrid aspen that were here found by musicians. And others here like these bridges and the small water stream in the ALNARP landscape lab. It's a hidden valley part, and if we had just constructed one bridge, no one would have experienced this as a place. But now it becomes something extra. So you have to do it more than you believed. And other examples. This we call Eric's catwalk to the left, and then Morten's wetland cafe to the right. And I mean, very simple things to do, but striking. This is then East Asia with fern, which is absolutely fantastic all seasons. And it's the only one we can find in Scandinavia, for sure. Here it's more mature. And these are other examples of where we have used the feed layer and colorful exotics.
In compost soil.
In compost soil, yeah. And this concept is to build up a garden approach inside and then have a hedge of boxes, and then a wilderness concept outside and very close to each other. And they work as a kind of two contrasts. This case, we call it Dana Square, where we have experimented with the light and shadow. And it's something which people notice and are positive about.
Also light gravel.
So other seasons, it's very much a question of light. And finally, this place of Lynn, where she was an artist and she liked traveling in Europe in mountain landscapes, and every time she came home, she were missing the mountain landscape. So she wanted to offer at least children a kind of miniature ridges of mountains by this pruning of beaches like this, and larch became transformed from a timber tree to a mountain tree. And we have also stimulated others to visit us and come and work with us. In this case, this is students from film and music of outdoor performance who came to ALNARP and found the landscape lab and were so enthusiastic, and then have come back again. And from that, we started a master degree program together with Leeds in England and Porto in Portugal. So that was pretty many examples. I hope that through the graphics that you have understood it, and the main messages I wanted to bring to you, and hope that you find something interesting. Thank you.
I think we need a round of applause. Maybe people can show their little icons there. Well, thank you so much, Roland. That was really it's an amazingly impressive body of work, and I certainly appreciate the sort of the length of kind of time and duration that you've been able to have this sort of intimate relationship with these landscapes and be able to kind of speak about them in such a detail and personality. But I guess I'd like to open it up to questions first that might sort of generate discussion, and feel free to use the chat channel as well.
I have a question for you. Thank you for the talk. The lollipop trees that don't know how to live together, were those nursery trees, or were they planted there and like pruned to be lollipop trees?
Well, they were bought as lollipops from the nurseries, that's for sure.
Okay.
So and it's a kind of standard quality of plants, very much used.
And do you think it's more because of what they learned underground, or more of what they learned above ground, or does it?
I can't answer that, but I think it's striking that they have difficulties to defend the size, and then they are not using the same group dynamics. There is in a kind of what you call it? No, unbalanced. I was thinking of there was in Swedish television yesterday evening about different monkeys, and there were these monkeys that were kept together, and the babians, and then as long as they kept together, they could manage the lion or geopard. But as soon as they went out as a kind of individual, they had no chance. And the same with trees, that they keep together, and genetically they are in a group connection.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very important for us to understand that. I think also they are, yeah, Eva says here that they are unbalanced, but I think also it should be said that that brings us to the discussion about creative management and design, that it should not be exclusively at the first day and then forgotten, but it's so important that the plants is so adaptable when they are about 3, 4, 5 years old up to 15, 20 years old, that you have a kind of second and third step coming in there in the design, because it's much, much better.
Any other questions? Well, while people are thinking of their questions, I'll go ahead and pose one. You obviously use drawing as a very sort of powerful tool in not only documenting, but there's a certain sort of dialogue I feel like you reach with the site through drawing. And just wondering if you might be able to speak more about that, sort of the time it takes, what why use drawing as opposed to sort of photography or some other means of sort of documentation?
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that we are challenging very much in our time and society, that maybe earlier generation of landscape architects have had a much easier situation, and it becomes more and more difficult, and laws and distrust and so on makes it more difficult, and we are working over long distances and so on. I was very proud of being guest professor in Ohio, and were of course interested of knowing why they wanted me. And one was to teach outdoor teaching, how you could, and to make these reflections about countryside and urban. But it was also about long-term projects. That is so unusual today that you can stay in project as a landscape architect. So very often you're splitter and you go on, and how can you then create a kind of experience of what happens through the years? And I think the university and the school has a very important task there. And also that university has an important backing up situation for practice, because practice will never document and what makes it different and so on. They change their staff and so on. So it's very chaotic. And within this chaotic society, you have to find a kind of stability to understand dynamics and to work with dynamics.
Looks like we have a question from Shanyu and then Sarai. And Shanyu is just sort of remarking on, some of these documents take more than 10 years. Just curious, how long do these experiments usually take?
Could you repeat the question?
It's just to sort of remark on the sort of length of some of these experiments, and wondering if there is, I don't know, certain protocols or methods for determining how long you're kind of documenting a particular site, or is it, I don't know, based on sort of site circumstances or circumstances?
I think you should use several complementary methods. So mathematics and statistics, I think numeric, it's okay for me. But again, you have to interpret it and use time for interpretation. And it's dangerous trying to save time when you're out, because that means that you are not out together with the plants and together with the place as long as you should. And by this, you have to find another approach which balance that, which is very slow. So, and we have found this profile diagram to be probably the most effective of everything. But if you make those kind of profile diagrams in different situations, different ages, you get a kind of feeling inside your body of understanding, which is there. And I mean, I've tested myself so much together with other professions and found that I'm good. And why am I good? I mean, it's just only luck. I think profile diagram drawings is very important. I have had students that have asked, how for a long time will you have us standing here? And I said, like, some half a day, and they say, you're crazy, half a day. And then I said, actually, I would like you to have you over a whole weekend for 2-3 days. And then afterwards, they come to me and said that, well, now we understand you. And it was really something great, because we think about it in another way today. So it's a kind of maturity that you have to get into your own body.
And a slowing down, I think, from what you mentioned, sort of the chaotic and.
I mean, you have slow cooking, slow living, and so on. Very, very positive. So slow teaching for landscape architects, I think,
I
is
can get behind
very
that.
positive.
Looks like Sarai has a question for us as well. She thanks you for the talk. Says that you mentioned ecologists as part of your team and that there's often a sort of tendency for landscape architects to kind of limit their ecological understanding to plants alone, which can potentially reduce our understanding of sort of the complexity of ecosystems. And so she's curious whether other species have been taken into consideration in understanding landscape dynamics, either the impact of plant architecture experiments on other species or the other way around. Maybe Roland froze. Is that just me? I think. Roland, if you can hear us, it looks like you froze. I thought I was going to be the one that was going to have internet problems. Oh, he's gone. Maybe he's going to log back in.
I have a question for the meantime that maybe you can answer, Matthew. What's the
Sure.
alternative in like a typical landscape setting? We have to buy lollipop trees, right? Like right now we don't have the options for like a park, a planned park in the city or whatever. And if he comes back, just stop.
Wait, what's your question?
Like,
About lollipop trees?
don't we just have to buy trees from nurseries?
Usually, yeah. I mean, usually that's the model. It can be really fascinating. Obviously, you kind of put in orders and they can just send you whatever you want. Or a lot of firms are very particular about the actual individual trees or plants. And so they'll go to a nursery. And I mean, it can be across the country. I mean, it can also be on the other side of the world. And you actually tag the exact sort of specimens you want for your project, which is pretty fascinating. I mean, I would imagine there's probably some. I mean, it's rare, but I imagine there are some sort of operations that are also growing their own plant materials, for lack of a better word, plants. I mean, I used to before grad school in landscape architecture, I worked for a design build. A garden design build company, and they grew a lot of their plants. I mean, they bought some from other nurseries, but they sort of had their design build operation and their sort of nursery wing of their operation, which was pretty interesting, where they did some of their own propagation and things like that. And so I think it just sort of varies, but traditionally you're saying you want I don't know, like a dozen cypresses, and they send at a certain sort of caliber, at a certain sort of size of kind of root mass or pot, and then they just kind of send you whatever. We have someone else kind of talking about transplanting here. That's Rebecca.
And also a lot of the, the ones that are burlap bound bagged root balls, those ones are like field grown generally. So like, I don't know if people are doing it, but like theoretically you could be doing the same thing, but just on site, because those can't be grown in containers. They have to be grown in a field, then dug up and put in the bag, and then put out back and then put into the site, which makes them like really difficult. Like some plants you can't even like grow really.
Yeah, they just really don't like transplanting.
Yeah. So.
And then, there's, I bet Shanti could probably answer this better than myself. But there's also the sort of, what is it? They say that for every sort of inch of diameter of like a tree, it's going to take that many years for the tree to actually sort of situate itself within the site and begin growing. It looks like Roland is back with us, right?
Hello.
There he is. Hello, Roland.
Hello.
Guess we lost you. I thought I was gonna be the one with internet issues.
It was a problem.
Yeah, probably maybe a problem in Sweden.
Yeah, no worries. I don't. What was the question? Oh, we're talking about Sarai's question. So kind of thinking about sort of ecology and sort of branching beyond just sort of plants, but other sort of species, and how your work and your experiments have potentially interacted with that.
I think that the plant ecologists, they had a long period where they were very fruitful for landscape architects and planners when they identified plant communities and as a kind of system thinking. And also they were interested in spatial aspects. But then after that, they went away to talk more about individual species, threatened species, rare species, and so on. So they individualized the ecology and talking about masses and quantity and so on. But I think that for us, it's a rich possibility to use what the ecologists did in the earlier period, but go on to stress the spatial aspects much more. So for us, it's not enough to know that a species is present, but it is that it's vital enough to have a good architecture and so on. But I think for the landscape architects and why we succeed with the landscape lab is to share interest in a wider field than landscape architecture. So I mean, you can love ecology and ecologists and your foresters and also you overlap, and also you let them test to work with your methods and approaches and so on. And that way, this overlapping, I think, is very good, and you become a team. So you stand side by side and work very well together. And we have done that.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important, and we're hoping to do that with our own site here. I mean, right now it's kind of just laying the groundwork with kind of in-house, but we're hoping to reach out to those in environmental sciences and others. As my class knows, there's going to be an organismal ecologist, Manuel Lardau, who's going to come and work with us briefly for the studio. I guess the chat here, that's a different conversation. Any other questions?
I think that what Humboldt discovered and what we have discovered, that to talk and go together in mixed group and also in groups with just landscape architects and so on, but having an arena, being out in the concrete, which is stimulating the visionary, and also not only the visionary, but the understanding of each other. I mean, if you go into an anonymous room and you're sitting there talking, so it's so extremely difficult to understand each other. So when it comes to such important things, it's so incredibly important to be able to meet outside like this, to use the examples.
Mm-hmm.
You can take it back all the way to Aristoteles and contextual knowledge and situation-led knowledge, and not only lean on general knowledge and a high generality and anonymous thinking.
Yeah, I guess that's one sort of benefit of the pandemic, is forcing us outside. I think parks and other sort of natural spaces have almost been overrun with use, which is kind of interesting. And I guess another question as far as kind of curriculum and how ALNARP's landscape lab feeds into the curriculum. I think you sort of touched on this during your presentation, but could you speak in more detail how the sort of landscape lab's operations are sort of tied with the curriculum of the school?
Well, we went into a period where every sector should take its own environmental responsibility. So flora and fauna values and so on should mainly be taken by agriculture and forestry itself. And through this, you get more for your production, for your products and so on. So it was very much politically correct. And the university, of course, wanted to take the lead. So the top of the university supported us extremely much. And to have that trust was very, very important. So then we asked them, how big do you think we should make the landscape laboratory at the campus? And then the most responsible persons, they said to us, well, don't make it too big, because then you will get a lot of enemies. Make it small and make it grow and persuade us. And we are sure that it will become very, very big. And I think that was wonderful, wise. And I think it shows that there are, of course, extremely much of competition also that you have to take care of, because you can't come somewhere if you don't go together. And you could say that the agriculture people, if you look at the world and how many good examples are kind of multiple use in agriculture landscape, there are very, very few. But in forestry, there are many. And also in this case, the foresters were actually moving to the northern part of Sweden with their main departments. And then as a complement, they would like to set down a forest department also at our campus. But there were not so much of forest. And of course, it was important for us then to give them trees so they could feel that they were home also at ALNARP. And for them. So, and I know that the head of our university, that he was listening very much to the foresters, and they were production and economy led. And when we stood standing together like a team, side by side, he liked us as well.
Nice. So any final questions from the group?
I would like to add something about this courses and students.
Sure.
Eva said that, I mean, we created special courses at specialist level. We started when they were in the second year and third year, but then came along with half a year courses or a quarter, I mean, half of a half year courses at the fourth or the fifth year. And they became very popular, and also from European students, not from Sweden, they became very popular. And I think this mixture of having many teachers involved and having many students expecting something has been very creative and energetic and very positive. So I think that is part of this happy fairy tale.
Yes. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us, Roland. Really wonderful presentation, wonderful discussion. Appreciate you taking the time, being across the Atlantic Ocean there. I just want to give a quick plug to our sort of next speaker in the series. Well, next speakers, I should say, Katie McDonald and Kyle Schumann, architects actually here at UVA. So this is for the few architects of the group. But thank you again, Roland. Really appreciate it. I hope we'll be in touch.
Yeah.